The winter in the high desert was unlike anything most people imagined. During the day, the sun shone on the land, but as soon as evening arrived, a cold wind swept across the hills and valleys. Snow covered the ground in soft layers, hiding the earth beneath it. The silence of the land was so deep that a person could hear the wind brushing against the sides of an old wooden cabin. In this quiet and lonely place lived a cowboy named Thomas Hale. He had worked on this land for years, caring for his small ranch and the horses that depended on him. Thomas was not a man who feared the cold. He understood the hardships of winter. He had lived through storms that lasted for days and nights. Still, even he knew that this particular storm was different. The sky had turned a deep gray, and the clouds above seemed heavy, as if they would burst at any moment. The wind had started early that morning, and by late afternoon, thick snowflakes began to fall slowly, then faster, until the entire world became a blur of white. Inside the cabin, Thomas sat near the fire with a cup of hot coffee warming his hands. His horse, Ranger, stayed inside the small barn beside the cabin, safe from the storm. Thomas had already locked up the chickens and checked the fences. He had finished his work early because he knew stepping out after dark in such weather would be risky. The storm was expected to grow worse through the night, and he had no reason to leave the safety of his cabin. He leaned back in his old wooden chair and listened to the wind whistling outside. The fire cracked softly, sending sparks upward. It was a calm moment, despite the storm outside. He was used to such solitude. Out here, visitors were rare. Days could pass without seeing another human face. Yet, Thomas never truly felt lonely. The land itself kept him company. The sounds of nature, the presence of his animals, and the peaceful rhythm of ranch life were enough for him. But on this night, the silence of the land was broken in the most unexpected way. At first, he thought he had imagined it. A very light sound, a soft tap. It came again, faint, hesitant, almost swallowed by the wind. He sat up straighter, placing the cup gently on the table. He listened nothing. Then, suddenly, another tap came, this one clearer. Thomas stood and moved toward the door with careful steps. His mind was confused. Who could possibly be out here in this weather? Anyone traveling would have taken shelter long before the storm reached this strength. It made no sense for someone to be outside. But the knock came again, this time weaker, as if the person behind it had little strength left. He opened the door slowly, pushing it against the wind. The cold air rushed inside, making the fire flicker behind him. At first, he saw only snow blowing in the darkness. Then he noticed a shape small, fragile, and nearly covered with snow. It was a woman. Her hair, long and dark, was frozen in places. Her clothes were thin for winter weather, and her boots looked worn, as if she had walked a long distance. Her face was pale from the cold, and her eyes, though half open, were full of exhaustion. For a moment, Thomas simply stood there, taken by surprise. He had seen Apache families in town before, but he had never had one appear at his doorstep, especially not in such a storm. The young woman swayed slightly, and he realized she was close to collapsing. Without thinking further, he reached out and gently helped her inside. The warmth of the cabin hit her immediately, but instead of speaking, she simply tried to catch her breath. Thomas led her to a chair near the fire. Her hands were trembling, and her lips were turning a faint shade of blue. She looked as if she had been walking through the storm for hours. He hurried to get a blanket. The woman did not resist when he wrapped it around her shoulders. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth touch her skin. She looked exhausted. But there was something else in her expression, something like deep worry or fear. She kept glancing toward the window, as if afraid someone might appear outside. Thomas noticed this but did not ask questions yet. He knew she needed warmth and rest before anything else. He placed a cup of warm water in her hands. She held it slowly, as if even the simple act of lifting her hands required great effort. After a few small sips, color began returning to her face. He sat across from her, speaking gently so she would not feel alarmed. He asked her name, but she did not answer at first. Her voice seemed stuck in her throat, perhaps from the cold or from something deeper. After a long pause, she finally whispered, "Nayeli." Her voice was soft, almost fragile, as if it might disappear any moment. Thomas nodded, acknowledging her name with a warm smile. He did not pressure her with more questions. He simply said, "You're safe here. Rest as long as you need." The fire glowed brighter, casting warm light across the room. The storm outside raged with full force, the wind pushing against the walls of the cabin. But inside, the atmosphere slowly grew calm. Nayeli sat quietly, warming her hands. She looked around the room as if trying to understand where she was. The simple wooden shelves, the tools hanging on the wall, the old rug on the floor, all of it was foreign to her. Yet it felt safe. Thomas could see that she was still nervous. She kept her back straight, and her eyes darted around the room every so often. It seemed clear to him that she had endured something difficult, something that had driven her into the storm. But he also knew she would speak only when she felt ready. Until then, the best thing he could do was offer comfort and space. He began preparing a small bowl of warm soup made from the little he had. While he worked, he tried to make the room feel even more welcoming. He stoked the fire, making sure it stayed strong. He spoke to her gently whenever he moved, so she would know she was not alone in this strange place. Minutes passed, then nearly an hour, and still, Nayeli said very little. But Thomas noticed tiny changes. Her breathing slowed, her shoulders relaxed, and she stopped looking toward the door as often. She was beginning to feel a bit safer. Outside, the storm intensified, snow hitting the windows with heavy gusts. The night grew colder, darker, and far more dangerous. Thomas knew that if he had not opened the door when he did, the woman might not have survived much longer. The thought made him shiver, not from the cold, but from the realization of how fragile life could be in such conditions. When he finally placed the bowl of soup in front of Nayeli, she looked at him with quiet gratitude. She murmured a soft thank you. Her voice slightly stronger this time. She began to eat slowly, each spoonful warming her from the inside. Thomas sat nearby but gave her space. He kept his eyes on the fire, allowing her to feel that she was not being watched or pressured. He knew trust took time, especially for someone who appeared to have gone through something frightening. The hours passed quietly. The storm outside showed no signs of calming. But inside the cabin, something gentle began to grow, a silent understanding. Two strangers, brought together by chance and weather, sharing a space of warmth while the world outside froze. Nayeli finished the soup and placed the bowl down carefully. She looked at Thomas, and for the first time since arriving, her eyes held a hint of relief. She still seemed afraid of something, but she no longer looked like she would collapse. Thomas, seeing this, felt a sense of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He did not know who she was, where she had come from, or why she had been wandering in such weather, but he knew one thing clearly. She needed safety, warmth, and time to regain her strength, and he could provide that. The night continued, long and cold. But inside the small cabin, the fire burned bright, keeping the darkness away. And as the hours slowly passed, the cowboy and the frozen Apache woman began to share the first quiet steps of a story that neither of them had expected, but both of them would remember forever. The next morning arrived slowly, as if the sun itself had trouble waking up after such a long and heavy night. The storm had not stopped completely, but it had softened. Snow still fell outside, but in quieter flakes, drifting gently through the cold air. The world looked calm again, though it carried the deep stillness that follows a long night of harsh weather. Inside the cabin, Thomas moved quietly so he wouldn't disturb Nayeli. She had finally fallen asleep near the fire sometime after midnight, wrapped in 2 warm blankets. Her face looked calmer now, no longer as pale as when she first arrived. Her breathing was steady, It was clear that the warmth and rest had already helped her recover a little. Thomas brewed himself some coffee and stepped near the window. The land outside was covered in a thick layer of snow. Everything looked untouched and pure, as if the storm had washed away all signs of yesterday. But he knew the beauty could be deceiving. Hidden under the snow were cold winds, slippery paths, and dangerous conditions for anyone traveling alone. He turned to look at Nayeli again. She was so still that for a moment he wondered if she was awake. But when he stepped closer, she slowly opened her eyes. For a second, she looked unsure of where she was. Her eyes moved around the cabin, taking in the wooden walls, the small table, the fire, and finally Thomas. She blinked, then sat up slowly, holding the blanket close around her shoulders. "You're safe," Thomas said softly, making sure his voice sounded calm and gentle. He did not want to startle her. Nayeli nodded but did not speak right away. She seemed to be gathering her thoughts. The warmth had brought some life back into her face, but her eyes still held shadows, as if memories she didn't want to remember were still close to her mind. "Would you like some warm water?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded again. Thomas poured a cup and handed it to her carefully. She accepted it with both hands. Her fingers were no longer shaking as badly as last night, but they were still cold. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was clearer today, though still soft. Thomas smiled. "You're welcome." They sat in silence for a little while. The only sounds came from the fire crackling and the faint wind outside. It was not an uncomfortable silence, just a quiet moment between two people who were still learning how to be near each other. After a few minutes, Thomas began preparing a simple breakfast. As he cooked, Nayeli watched him quietly. She did not seem scared anymore, but she seemed cautious, as if she was afraid of saying or doing something wrong. "How are you feeling?" Thomas asked while slicing bread. "Better," she replied softly. "Much better." "I'm glad to hear that." Nayeli looked down at her hands for a moment, then said, I'm sorry I came without warning." Thomas shook his head immediately. "No need to apologize. Anyone would open their door to someone needing help. And last night, you really needed it." Nayeli took a slow breath. "Yes." Her tone carried a weight that made Thomas look at her closely. He still did not want to push her with questions, but he knew she was hiding something painful or frightening. Still, he believed she would speak when she trusted him enough. Breakfast was simple: warm bread, some beans, and a cup of hot tea. For Thomas, it was ordinary food. But for Nayeli, it felt like a feast. She ate slowly at first, but once she realized it was safe and warm, she took more bites, her hunger showing through. As she ate, Thomas finally asked one gentle question. "How far had you been walking before you reached the cabin?" Nayeli lowered her gaze. Her hands stopped moving for a moment. "A long time," she said. "Longer than I should have." "That storm could have been dangerous," Thomas said softly. "It was," she replied. "But I had to keep walking." Her answer was simple, but it carried a meaning that Thomas understood. Something was pushing her forward, something strong enough to make her face freezing winds and deep snow. He looked at her with calm curiosity but didn't ask more. She noticed his gentle expression and seemed relieved that he wasn't pressing her. Throughout the morning, the storm outside softened even more. Snow still coated everything, but the sky was lighter now. Still, leaving the cabin in such conditions would be unsafe, especially for someone who had barely escaped last night. "You should stay here until you're fully well," Thomas said. "The weather isn't ready for traveling." Nayeli hesitated. "I don't want to trouble you." "You aren't troubling me," he replied sincerely. "A person's life matters more than a little extra company." Her eyes softened, grateful, but still unsure. "Thank you," she whispered again. Thomas nodded. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." As the hours passed, Nayeli slowly began to open up. She started noticing small things in the cabin books on a shelf. A handmade wooden cup, an old lasso hanging near the door. She asked quiet questions about them, and Thomas answered them with simple explanations. These small conversations made the room feel warmer. She learned that Thomas had lived alone on this ranch for many years. His nearest neighbor lived miles away. He spent most days working with his horse, fixing fences, and caring for the land. He had grown used to silence, but he did not seem lonely. He liked the quiet. And Thomas learned bits about her not from direct questions, but from the way she spoke or from the stories she shared, without going into detail. She mentioned her family briefly, her home far from the ranch, and how she used to walk through forests and hills. She spoke carefully, choosing her words, as if trying not to give away the parts she wasn't ready to speak about. Thomas noticed that every now and then, she would stop talking suddenly and look toward the window or door. Her expression would shift slightly, as if she was listening for something outside, something she feared. Around midday, Thomas stepped outside briefly to check on Ranger, his horse. He made sure the animal had enough hay and water. While doing so, he noticed something unusual. There were faint tracks in the snow, not old ones, but fresh. They didn't belong to him or his horse. Someone else had passed through the area early in the morning. He studied the tracks for a moment, then returned to the cabin. Nayeli was sitting near the fire, her hands folded in her lap. When Thomas entered, she looked up at him immediately, as if she expected bad news. He didn't mention the tracks. Not yet. He didn't want to frighten her. "Everything's fine," he said calmly as he hung his coat. Nayeli nodded, but he could see something behind her eyes, a worry that had never gone away. They spent the afternoon inside, talking in small pieces, sharing quiet moments, and listening to the wind. Thomas fixed a broken drawer, and Nayeli helped him by holding nails and handing him tools. It was the first time she had smiled, a small, brief smile, but enough to show that she felt safe with him. Later, she helped feed the fire, carefully placing logs inside. "It reminds me of home," she whispered. "My family used to sit around a fire like this." Thomas watched her gently. "Do you think they're worried about you?" She paused. Her eyes grew distant. "Yes," she said softly. "If they knew where I was, they would be worried." Her words were simple, yet they hinted at something deeper. The day slowly turned into evening. The storm had passed now, leaving a quiet, white world outside. The sky grew darker, and the cabin once again became the warm center of the cold night. As Thomas prepared supper, Nayeli finally spoke a little more than before. "I didn't plan to come here," she said softly. "I didn't know anyone lived on this land." "I know," Thomas replied gently, "but I'm glad you made it here." She looked at him with calm eyes. "You helped me without asking anything. You could have closed the door last night. You didn't." He shrugged lightly, but inside, her words touched him. It wouldn't be right to leave anyone out in that storm. There was another moment of silence, but this time it felt warm, not heavy. Nayeli then said, almost in a whisper, "I'm still scared. Not of you, but of what might come." Thomas looked at her carefully. It was the first time she admitted this. "You don't need to be scared here," he said. "Whatever trouble you're facing, we'll handle it. But you should rest first." Nayeli nodded, and though her worry didn't vanish completely, something in her face relaxed. She felt protected in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. As night settled in, they sat near the fire again. The flames glowed softly, casting shadows on the walls. The quiet between them was peaceful now, like two people sharing a calm moment after a long journey. In that warm cabin, surrounded by snow and silence, two strangers were slowly becoming something more, companions brought together by chance, kindness, and trust. The fear Nayeli carried was still inside her, but she no longer carried it alone. Thomas had unknowingly become her shelter, not just from the storm outside, but from whatever storm she had faced before reaching his door. And though neither of them yet knew what challenges were waiting just beyond the quiet snow-covered hills, both felt that the first small bond of trust had been formed, something strong enough to guide them through whatever came next. The next morning brought a soft light over the snow-covered land. The storm had completely passed, leaving a quiet and peaceful world behind. The sky was pale blue, and the sunlight reflected off the snow so brightly that it made the whole valley glow. It was the kind of morning that looked calm on the surface, but Thomas felt something unsettled inside him. He woke early, as he always did, and stepped outside to breathe the cold air. His breath formed small clouds that drifted away slowly. The land felt still. Too still. He looked around the ranch, checking the fences and the barn. Ranger was eating hay, happily unaware of anything unusual. But when Thomas walked a few steps past the barn, he noticed the same thing he had seen the day before: tracks. They were faint, but they were there. Footprints that didn't belong to him. And definitely not to Nayeli. Fresh enough to worry him. Someone had been close to the cabin again. He crouched down and looked closely at the snow. The tracks led in a direction that suggested someone had been watching the cabin from a distance. Whoever it was hadn't come close, but they had been near enough to keep an eye on the place. Thomas stood slowly, his jaw tightening with concern. He wasn't someone who jumped to conclusions, but he was someone who paid attention to the land, and the land was telling him something. Someone else was out there. He walked back toward the cabin, his thoughts heavy. When he entered, Nayeli was awake, sitting near the fire with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked more rested than before, but there was still a quiet fear hiding in her eyes. "Good morning," Thomas said calmly. She nodded. "Good morning." He filled a cup with warm water and handed it to her. She accepted it with a gentle, "Thank you," and took small sips. Thomas watched her quietly, wondering how much she was ready to share. After a few moments, she looked up at him. "You went outside early?" "Yes," he replied. She hesitated. "Is everything all right?" Thomas glanced toward the window, then back at her. He didn't want to worry her too much, but he also knew honesty was important now. "There were tracks in the snow," he said softly. "Footprints. Someone's been near the ranch." Nayeli's hands froze around the cup. Her eyes widened just slightly, enough for Thomas to see the fear return. He sat down across from her. "Do you know who might be looking for you?" For a long time, she did not answer. Her eyes stared into the fire, as if the flames reminded her of memories she wasn't ready to face. Her breath grew slower, deeper. As she tried to gather courage, finally, she whispered, "Yes." Thomas didn't interrupt. He waited patiently. Nayeli took a shaky breath. "I left my home because people wanted to take me somewhere I didn't want to go. They were trying to force me into a life I never agreed to." She paused, choosing every word with care. "I ran away before they could find me again." Thomas listened quietly, not judging, not interrupting. He could feel her fear, her uncertainty, her desperation. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was quiet, hidden inside her, but strong. "How far had you walked?" he asked gently. 2 days, she whispered. "Through the forest, through the valley, and then into the snow. I thought maybe the storm would hide me. I thought maybe they would stop following me." Her voice trembled. "But I think they're still looking." Thomas nodded slowly. "The tracks outside. They might belong to them." Nayeli lowered her head, her hands tightening around the cup. "I didn't want to bring trouble to your home." "You didn't," Thomas said firmly. "Whatever is happening, it's not your fault." She looked up, her eyes shining with gratitude mixed with worry. "You don't have to help me anymore. If I leave now..." "No," Thomas said immediately, shaking his head. "You're not leaving. Not while someone might be searching for you out there. It's not safe." "Oh," her lips trembled slightly. "But you don't even know me. Why would you risk helping me?" Thomas leaned back in his chair and sighed softly. "Sometimes you don't need to know everything about a person to do what's right. You came to my door in trouble. That makes it my responsibility to keep you safe until you're ready and strong enough to decide your next step." Nayeli looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, perhaps disbelief, perhaps relief, perhaps both. She had lived with fear for so long that kindness felt strange to her. For the rest of the morning, she stayed quiet, thinking about everything she had shared. Thomas didn't pressure her with more questions. He simply made the cabin feel warm and safe, giving her time to breathe. Around midday, he stepped outside again to bring more firewood. While lifting the logs, he felt a strange sensation, the sense of being watched. He paused, looking at the tree line in the distance. The world seemed empty, but the feeling didn't leave him. He returned inside quickly. Nayeli noticed his expression. "Is something wrong?" Thomas took a deep breath. "I'm not sure, but I think someone is watching the ranch." Nayeli's eyes filled with worry. "They're here." He sat beside her. "Not inside. And they haven't come close. They're keeping their distance." She swallowed hard. "They won't stop." Thomas looked at her with a calm strength. "Then we won't let them get you." For the first time, Nayeli saw something in him she hadn't seen before. A quiet bravery. A willingness to stand with her, even though he had nothing to gain. The afternoon passed slowly. Thomas checked the cabin door twice. Nayeli stayed near the fire, her mind filled with heavy thoughts. And though the air inside was warm, there was a tension in both of them, as if they were waiting for something unknown. Later, as the sky turned gold with sunset, Nayeli finally spoke again. "I didn't want to leave my family," she said in a trembling voice. "I only wanted peace. I only wanted to choose my own life." Thomas nodded. "Everyone deserves that. I thought if I ran far enough, they would stop," she whispered. "But now I've brought danger to your home." "You haven't," he said gently. "You brought yourself here. That's different. And helping someone who needs it isn't a burden. It's what a person should do." She wiped the corner of her eye, though no tear fell. "You're kind." Thomas gave a small, comforting smile. "You'd do the same if someone came to you in need." Nayeli wasn't sure about that, but she appreciated the kindness in his words. Night arrived quietly, the stars appearing above the snowy hills. The cabin felt warm, but the outside world felt bigger than ever. The unknown footsteps in the snow, the silent trees, the sense that someone, somewhere, was still searching. Thomas lit another lamp and began preparing supper. When he placed the bowl of warm vegetables in front of Nayeli, she looked at it but didn't touch it right away. Her thoughts were miles away, drifting somewhere deep. "Thomas," she said softly, "if they find me here, I don't want you to get in trouble. I don't want anything to happen because of me." "Nothing will happen," he said calmly. "You don't know that," she whispered. "No," he replied gently. "But I know this. No one should face their fears alone. And you won't." Her eyes softened. She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to understand why someone would stand beside her with so much sincerity. In the quiet cabin, trust grew deeper, not because of big actions, but because of simple kindness. The night stretched on. Thomas stayed awake longer than usual, listening to the quiet outside. He checked the door, the window, the shadows. He wasn't a man who feared easily, but he was aware of responsibility now. Responsibility for the woman resting in his home. Nayeli, for the first time in many days, slept deeply. She felt safe under his roof, even though danger lingered beyond the hills. As Thomas sat near the fire, he knew the coming days would not be simple. Someone was searching for Nayeli. Someone determined, and though she had nothing to offer when she arrived, she had brought something unexpected. A purpose. A reason for him to protect. A connection neither of them had planned. The peaceful night continued, but both their hearts knew the truth even in calm moments. The world outside was quietly changing, and soon, they would have to face whatever was coming. As the first signs of spring touched the land, the snow outside the cabin began to melt. The long, cold winter that once felt endless was finally losing its grip. The cowboy could hear the soft dripping of water from the roof each morning and smell the damp earth beneath the thinning layers of ice. It was a gentle reminder that life was returning, and with it came new choices and challenges. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had also changed. Where once there had been silence and uncertainty, there was now a sense of calm comfort. The Apache woman had grown stronger each day. Her cheeks were no longer pale. Her eyes, once clouded with exhaustion and fear, were now bright and observant. She moved with more confidence around the small space, learning quickly where everything belonged. Her bond with the cowboy had deepened in ways neither of them had planned. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It grew quietly, like a seed finding its way through cold soil. They still didn't speak much at first, but the silence between them transformed. What once felt heavy now felt warm and peaceful. A simple nod, a shared glance, or the passing of a cup of warm drink carried meaning neither of them needed to explain. One morning, the cowboy stepped outside to check on the animals. The ground was still hard, but patches of brown earth peeked through. The sky was lighter, carrying a soft blue tone that reminded him of early summer. When he returned inside, the woman was waiting with a bowl of warm broth she had prepared. She quietly placed it in his hands. He smiled, a little surprised. She noticed his smile and looked slightly shy, but pleased. Slowly, their days began to fit together like pieces of a simple life. He would chop wood while she prepared the fire. She would sew old clothes while he fixed the tools. They shared meals, shared the silence, shared the small moments that made the cabin feel less like two separate lives and more like one peaceful space. But as her strength returned, so did her thoughts about the world outside the cabin. She often stood near the window for long moments, looking out at the melting snow. The cowboy could see a softness in her expression, a longing, a connection to something beyond his small home. He knew that she belonged to a different world. She had family somewhere. Her people were out there, waiting, wondering, hoping for her safety. He felt a quiet ache inside him whenever he imagined her leaving. He had gotten used to her presence, the calmness she brought, the unspoken companionship that filled the long days. Losing that felt heavier than he expected. One evening, as they sat near the fire, the cowboy gently asked her the question he had kept inside for weeks. "Do you want to go back?" he said softly. She turned her head toward him. Her eyes held a mixture of sadness and calm understanding. She nodded slowly. It wasn't a rejection, it was an honest truth. She had a place in the world that was waiting for her. The cowboy felt a tightness in his chest, but he hid it behind a small smile. "Spring will open the trails," he said. "I'll help you find your way." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes softened with gratitude, something deep and heartfelt. She placed her hand over her heart, a gesture that said more than words ever could. As the days warmed further, they prepared for her journey. The cowboy repaired the old leather bag she had arrived with, sewing every torn piece with care. He made her a pair of soft, warm shoes from materials he had stored away. She watched him, touched by the effort he put into each detail. One afternoon, she surprised him by placing a beautifully woven bracelet in his hand. She had made it from small pieces of colored thread she found in the cabin. The pattern was delicate, carrying symbols from her culture, symbols of gratitude, respect, and connection. He looked at the bracelet, unsure what to say. She gently wrapped it around his wrist. Her fingers lingered for a moment, and the cowboy felt warmth spread through him. The night before her departure, neither of them slept much. The fire burned low, casting soft shadows around the room. She sat on her side of the cabin, and he sat on his. They didn't need to talk. The silence itself held their thoughts, the memories they had formed, the bond they had built, and the bittersweet acceptance of tomorrow's separation. When the morning arrived, the sky was clear. The air was cold but no longer harsh. The cowboy saddled his horse and packed enough supplies for her to travel safely. She stepped outside, looking healthier, stronger, and more at peace than the day she had arrived frozen at his door. He walked with her to the edge of the open trail. Each step felt heavier than the last. When they reached the place where the snow thinned into a clear path leading toward her homeland, they stopped. She turned toward him, her eyes full of emotion. She reached out and gently touched his arm. It was a farewell gesture, but also a thank you. A deep, wordless thank you for saving her life, for giving her warmth, for offering kindness when she had nothing to give in return. The cowboy nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "You'll be safe now," he said. "And you'll be home." She looked at him once more. Then she stepped back, slowly turning toward the open land. Her figure moved gracefully, her steps steady and confident. The cowboy watched her walk farther and farther, until the wind carried her silhouette into the morning light. For a long time, he stood there, staring at the empty path. The bracelet on his wrist felt warm against his skin, reminding him of the woman who had walked into his life in the coldest season and left behind a quiet change he would carry forever. When he finally turned back toward the cabin, it felt different, quieter, a little emptier, but it also felt full of memories, full of moments that had shaped him in gentle ways. He returned to his routine, but he carried a new stillness within him. A peaceful understanding that sometimes people come into our lives for a short time, yet leave a lasting imprint. As the days turned into weeks, he found himself glancing toward the trail every once in a while, wondering how she was, hoping she reached her family safely. Though he knew she belonged to another world, a part of him held on to the connection they shared. Simple, pure, unexpected, and somewhere far away, the Apache woman walked with her people again, her heart carrying the warmth of a stranger who became a part of her story. She remembered his kindness, his quiet strength, and the shelter he offered her when she had nothing but herself to give. The mountains, the forests, and the soft winds now carried both of their stories, two different paths that crossed only for a moment, yet changed them in ways neither could forget.